This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for staying with us through. I think that the numbers actually have gotten bigger since we first started, which is a good sign on Friday morning. But thank you for staying us through the duration of the conference, and thank you for the guests who have joined us for this event. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Irene Ramalho. Professor Ramalho embodies the migratory condition of our globalized society. After finishing her modern languages degree in Germanic philology at the University of Coimbra, in Portugal, as you may know, she went on to obtain a PhD in American Studies at Yale University in 1973 with a dissertation entitled Poetry in Hesperia, Wallace Stevens and the Romantic Tradition. She retained these transatlantic affiliations and is currently Professor of English, American Studies and Feminist Studies at the University of Coimbra, where she is also a senior researcher at the Center for Social Studies. And she is also, in her other role, across the Atlantic, international affiliate at the Department of Comparative Literature of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she teaches courses on poetry and poetic theory, English and American Studies, and contemporary Portuguese literature. She is best known to most of us as the author of Atlantic Poets, Fernando Pessoa's Turn in Anglo-American Modernism, which came out in 2003, a groundbreaking book which places Fernando Pessoa, Portugal's major modernist poet, in a transatlantic literary context, revealing the rich interconnections between his work and that of Anglo-American modernists ranging from Whitman to Crane and Adrian Rich. In the process, she reveals Pessoa himself to be a major figure of the modernist and transatlantic tradition, an argument which she had already eloquently maintained in her 1993 paper, A Poesia como Sistema Mundial, Poetry as a World System. Relying on world systems theory, Ramalho, of which we heard about yesterday from Professor Perry, Professor Ramalho declares Pessoa the inventor of the semi-periphery and argues that his notion of Atlanticism represents the imaginative creation of a new imperialism of poets, which embraces the internationalist goal underpinning modernism, which we have been exploring here, and is comparable to Jolaza's notion of intercontinental modernism, of which we heard about yesterday from a very interesting panel. I was trying to look around for the person. I don't know if she's been able to stay this long. Professor Ramalho has published extensively on poetry in a comparative context and on women's poetry in World Literature Today, the Luso-Brazilian Review, Colóquio Letras, Dédalas, and many other journals. She has co-edited the volumes of essays Entre Ser e Estar, Raízes, Discursos e Percursos da Identidade, Between Being and Being There, Roots, Discourses and Roots of Identity from 2002, and more recently co-edited also Translocal Modernisms, International Perspectives with Peter Lang in 2008. Is, as far as I understand, has a co-edited volume entitled America Where? Transatlantic Views of the United States in the 21st Century, forthcoming with Peter Lang as well. I first met Professor Ramalho at a conference on intertextuality and rewriting, which was actually, her panel was actually chaired by Elder Macedo, who is here with us today. And this conference took place here at the IGRS in 2002. In which she gave a thought-provoking paper on Fernando Pessoa and rumination. So it is my pleasure to welcome her here today to present to us an equally thought-provoking address, I think, entitled what is peripheral about peripheral modernism.
Thank you so much, Patricia. It was wonderful, very generous, over generous introduction. Thank you very, very much. And thank you for having me here. I chose an epigraph for my paper, borrowed from Gilles Deleuze. It reads like this: Il n'y a que des mots inexacts pour désigner quelque chose exactement. There are no exact words to designate something exactly. Students of modernism know this all too well. Students of modernism, at least since Harry Levine's famous question of 1960, what was modernism? And particularly after Maurice Beeve's self-confident sort of reply in 1974, what modernism was, students of modernism know that as concerns their object of study, they are only inexact words to designate something exactly. More than that, they do know that the main problem is not that there are no exact words, but rather that there is no exact thing. For students of modernism, modernism is never exactly modernism. That is why they tend to use plural, modernisms, and frequently use modifiers. Our conference is about peripheral modernisms. Exactly at the same time, at least this is exact, exactly at the same time, a similar conference on modernism is taking place at the University of Oxford, right around the corner, gathering together many renowned scholars from different geographies of modernism. Andreas Huyssen, who once mapped geographies of modernism, is one of them, and for a good reason, moving modernisms. The Oxford Conference announces itself as a conference on moving modernisms. It claims to be concerned with the most significant directions in which study of the period has developed over the past 40 years. I emphasize the period, which, together with the discipline mentioned further down, seems to contradict the intended exploration, announced exploration of emergent geographies and shifting temporalities. Is modernism a period? Can it be considered a discipline? According to the modernist Modernity, the official journal of the Modernist Studies Association, modernism is both a period, roughly from 1860 to the present, and I'm tempted to ask, when does the present end? And a discipline, modernist studies, that's the discipline. Curiously enough, a very interesting multilingual and multicultural sensitive essay by Susan Stanford Friedman, published recently in this journal, that article ends up romantically describing modernism as a living organism. Modernism as a period is, of course, very useful, and I would not wish to discard that. When asked to write about American modernist poetry for the 5th volume of the Cambridge History of American Literature, published in 2003, I promptly produced an essay entitled Poetry in the Machine Age, explicitly linking modernism to modernity and modernization. Since Franklin Tricchia had already taken care of his modernist quartet, for this volume he wrote about Frost, Stevens, Pound, Eliot, I discussed 6 more poets: Gertrude Stein, William Carlos Williams, H.D., Marian Moore, Hart Crane, and Langston Hughes. Dates of birth ranging from 1874 to 1902. For me then, American modernist poems were clearly a period. To a certain extent, they still are. But my discovery while writing that essay was that the lyricism of all my 6 modernist poets was of more than one period, more than one time, and could be seen to reclaim present, past, and future. Just one example. HD went back to the Greeks, as she liked to say, and even before the Greeks, to reinvent the modern woman in her Helen in Egypt. Tradition and resistance to tradition are two sides of the same coin, just like center and periphery. I find the many qualifiers of modernism very interesting and never stop wondering about them. Here is how some of them: high, classic, canonic, aesthetic, primordial, late, epiphanic, social, hegemonic, reactionary, fascist, peripheral, moving, divergent, alternative, errant, mestizo, emergent, gendered, queer, international, transnational, transhemispheric, planetary. There are several more. I gather several more at this conference, but I'll spare you that. When in 2008, Antonio Sousa Ribeiro and I myself put together a collection of essays on the subject, the title we chose for it was also a modified plural: Translocal Modernisms. In our introduction, we too asked questions, even if not expecting them to be graced with exact answers. We asked not only the much repeated old questions, what is, what was, but two new ones. Why modernisms? And what will modernism be? This latter question of ours signifies that another famous question, Raymond Williams's "When was modernism?", while making sense to us as a survey of the relations of art to production and of modern art's accommodation to bourgeois values, seemed premature to us because of its suggestion of closure. Our wording pointed rather to the historicity and fragility of the concept of modernism as being in constant need of rigorous contextualization and reformulation, and I insist, present, past, and future. Although the essays included in our volume have a decisive literary bias, as incidentally my contribution here does too, shamelessly, translocal modernisms covered a wide spatial and temporal range of literary, artistic, cultural, and social fields and perspectives. Today, I confess I hesitate both before the plural, modernisms, and the qualification, translocal. Yeah, I did say I don't usually drink water while I speak. Okay, I started having serious misgivings when I received this kind of invitation to address this international conference and saw its very stimulating call for papers on peripheral modernisms. I started thinking of translocal modernisms, all these modifiers. Of course, I was aware of the use of the concept peripheral modernisms by such authors as Beatriz Arlo, Carlos Blanco, Harry Arutunian, Benita Pari, among others, but I have never really questioned it. Beyond the various kinds of art produced in geography that is peripheral to the speaking subject, what could be peripheral about peripheral modernism, I wonder? To speak at the periphery presupposes a center, thereby implying, willy-nilly, a value judgment. Periphery not being the center is different, and which it usually means in Western culture somehow inferior. Andreas Huyssen writes of metropolitan culture being translated, appropriated, and creatively mimicked in colonial and post-colonial countries. Could these be a fair description of art outside the speaking center? In Emmanuel Wallerstein's understanding of the modern world system, of course, periphery means economically less developed than the centers of international capital, and hence at an earlier stage of capitalism. But I submit that artistic creation works differently. Etymologically, periphery also means literally at the outer boundary of circumference. Not here, not at the center, but out there at the margins. To claim the circumference, as Emily Dickinson once arrogantly did, My business is circumference, she told Higginson. To claim the circumference is to question the centrality of the center, or rather, to question the reality of the center itself, as Derrida was to do a century later, a century after Dickinson. The center is not the center, he says, which means that the periphery is not the periphery either. This particular notion of periphery, a periphery that is not a periphery, does appeal to me, where the peripheral refers to the where of place, the when of time, the what of content, the how of form, or even suggesting world relevance, impact, and circulation. Aesthetic modernism began to be perceived at the turn of the 19th century as a fairly well-contained Western, if not heavily Anglo-American, literary artistic phenomenon, only soon to explode into the diversity and plurality which has not ceased to grow to this day, or to the present. Curiously enough, some of Harry Levine's core or canonical modernists were exiles or expatriates from what Wallerstein would later call the semi-periphery, if not the periphery itself. Some of these high modernists have been regularly borrowing from the periphery all along. So-called primitivism, exoticism, barbarism. Indeed, one of the most brilliant borrowers is one of the most quoted definers of modernism at its earliest stages, Charles Baudelaire, who saw modernity as bridging time and eternity. La modernité, c'est le transitoire, le fugitif, le contingent, la moitié de l'art, dont l'autre moitié est l'éternel et l'immuable. Modernity is the transient, the fleeting, the contingent. It is one half art, the other being the eternal and immovable. Published in 1863. This is the passage that is quoted all the time. Let me leave you, before I continue, with the next sentence, which is even more relevant for my purposes here. Il y a eu une modernité pour chaque penetration. There was a form of modernity for every painter of the past. Painter, of course, is artist and, I mean, poet too. A deep breath. Neither center nor periphery. This is, as you may recall, the title of one of the panels of our program. I was there, it was very interesting. I too would settle for modernism tout court. This is not to say that I would easily discard the many interlaced narratives of modernity, modernization, modernism, postmodernism, postmodernity. They are all part of the post-Enlightenment narrative of capitalism and colonialism. Capitalism reinforces, rather than replacing, colonialism, and both continue to trace what Boaventura de Sousa Santos calls the abyssal line of inclusion and exclusion of modernization. What we call modernization. Modernization and its attendant globalization really amount to what I would call, forgive me, capitalismization. That is to say, the obsession with accumulation, totalizing structures, and exhaustive controlling knowledge in its attempt to incorporate the outside world as an aligned or emergent or peripheral. Thus, by virtue of the unequal development of capitalism, is the outside kept firmly outside within omnivorous globalism. Post-colonial scholarship often gilds the impact of colonialism by highlighting the advantages of imperial development and modernization. One of the facets of aesthetic modernism is precisely its discontent with modernization, technological development, and infinite progress, the latter actually viewed as decadence. Benjamin, for example, saw modernity as fragmentary, as an illusion of progress, and as the new in the context of what has always been there. To be sure, this is also the discontent of reactionary modernism. In Translocal Modernisms, we included a very interesting analysis of Carl Schmitt and Ernst Junger as reactionary modernists, penned by Isabel Capello-Gil. Hitler's Mein Kampf can also be seen and has been seen as a good example of a reactionary modernist text. The truth is that both aesthetic and reactionary modernism regret the post-Enlightenment sense of an ending, but whereas reactionary modernism resorts to politicization of myths of national purification and regeneration with the disastrous consequences that we know, aesthetic modernism provides us with fictions that make human sense, but which never let us forget they are fictions, not myths. As eloquently put by Frank Kermode, whose sense of an ending I'm following here, fictions are, and I quote, not myths, and they are not hypotheses. You neither rearrange the world to suit them, nor test them by experiment, for instance, in gas chambers. Great poets are fine providers of fictions. Wallace Stevens being, for me, as for Kermode, one of the most eloquent. The final belief, he says, writes the inventor of the disquieting fiction of an absolute in Notes to All Supreme Fiction. The final belief is to believe in a fiction which you know to be a fiction, there being nothing else. The exquisite truth is to know that it is a fiction and that you believe in it willingly. If peoples and nations can be considered developed or underdeveloped, and can be oppressors or oppressed and subjected to hierarchization, art never is. Even if hegemonic criticism would conspire to make it so. For instance, by speaking of center and periphery. Or I would say even not just criticism, but syllabi, teaching syllabi, or presses, what they publish, etc. So, art cannot be hierarchized, I say. What I am suggesting is that the categories of Wallace Stevens' world system do not apply to art or poetry. This much is already acknowledged by Carlos Blanco, proudly writing Desde la Periferia, as he says, in 1998. Taking off from Baudelaire's realization that the modern has always been there for art, Blanco recalls the early peripherality of what was to be considered the center. The main characters of the avant-garde breaks with the 19th century, Marinetti, Picasso, Zara, Mayakovsky, Eisenstein, Piscator, Brecht, the constructivists, the Dadaists, are all peripheral artists and writers vis-à-vis the metropolitan centers of imperial capital, whether as regards geography, language, politics, or all three of them. When Maurice Beebe characterizes aesthetic modernism as the international revolution, I'm quoting, the international revolution in literature and the arts, which began in the late 19th century and flourished until the 1950s, his are inexact words to designate inexact things. In this paper, I borrow the inexact word modernism to refer to the permanent revolution in literature and the arts, which, being permanent, has always been happening at all times and places in many different ways. I concentrate on poetry shamelessly, as I say, in the broadest sense of the word. I concentrate on poetry to isolate consensually agreed upon features of central Western literary modernism, which I argue can be observed across languages, geographies, and centuries. This is admittedly my reading of Rimbaud's meaning when he provocatively stated that il faut être absolument moderne. One must be absolutely modern. My concept of modernism, with which, as you can tell, I'm increasingly tempted to discard, is thus closer to Paul de Man's concept of modernity and Giorgio Agamben's concept of the contemporary. It comes as no surprise that both these theoreticians of Baudelaire's fusion of presentness and timelessness take off from Nietzsche's complex reflections on history in the second of his unzeitgemäße Betrachtungen, untimely meditations. The meditation in question is entitled On the Uses and Disadvantage of History for Life. And its major points are, first, that though we cannot be reconciled cannot but be reconciled with history, as Nietzsche himself acknowledges, the value we ascribe to it is an Occidental prejudice. Second, that an excessive history is harmful to the living man. Third, that it is altogether impossible to live without forgetting. Fourth, that the past and present are one because of imperishable types. And therefore, fifth, that we must act counter to our time and thereby acting on our time. Untimely meditations. Untimely for Nietzsche thus means beyond all that is ephemeral. Drawing heavily on Nietzsche's second meditation, Paul de Man comes to the conclusion that, while transcending history, modernity, and I quote, acts as the principle that gives literature duration and historical experience. And that, since the poet, and I quote, is both the historian and the agent of his own language, literature has always been essentially modern. Giorgio Agamben, in turn, echoing Roland Barthes, quoting Nietzsche, states that the contemporary is the untimely. The contemporary, Agamben adds, implies a singular relation with one's time, which adheres to it, and at the same time keeps a distance from it. Those who coincide too well with epoch, those who are perfectly tied to it in every respect, are not contemporaries, precisely because they do not manage to see it. They are not able to firmly hold their gaze on it. The contemporary, then, is the one who interpolates her time, transforms it, and puts it in relation to other times. For Agamben, then, untimeliness or contemporariness is a question of timely relevance. Timely relevance is what I claim for all poetry and art from all times and geographies. Let me push the theoretician a little further. To be untimely is to be always in time, whether it be chronos, evo, or kairos, and to speak to time at all times. The poet, the strong poet, I should perhaps say after my beloved teacher Harold Bloom, the strong poet is always contemporary, precisely because the lack of coincidence of times allows him or her to perceive time's darkness, as in Whitman's Dark Patches in Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, and thereby disclose the light of time. Strong poetry, and by poetry, let me insist, I mean all strong literary production, that is to say, all the fictions that we believe in and continue to believe in. Strong poetry, I say, is always already untimely, contemporary, or if you like, modernist. Blake's bard, who present, past, and future sees in his introduction to Songs of Experience, speaks for the relevance of all untimely poets. And timeliness may well be the most compelling of our fictions. The Enlightenment promise of modernity as modernization and, if need, progress began to be put in question early on by the Romantics. Friedrich Schlegel's ironic concept of Unverständlichkeit, incomprehensibility, inaugurates what would become a major feature of modernism at the turn of the 19th century, by explicitly putting in question language's capacity to communicate. Later, Benjamin would further elaborate on this topic in his introduction to his translation of Baudelaire's Tableau de Parisian in 1923. Poets, of course, have always been fascinated by the materiality and uncanny opaqueness of language. Wallace Stevens called it the poet's gibberish, and the lingua franca et jocondissima. In the 15th century pre-Columbian America, Nezahualcóyotl, the Nahuatl poet, king and sage of Texcoco, was already expressing anxiety about the possibility of speaking true words. Instead, he conjured up flowers, feathers, and stones to say the unsayable. Centuries later, Hart Crane, under the spell of the ancient cultures of Mexico, would hanker after what he called the cognate word in his magnificent The Broken Tower, 1932. At about the same time in Brazil, João Guimarães Rosa, in Sagarana, 1938, was giving expression to the inexpressible by searching deep into the possibilities of the Portuguese language, hybridizing it and rendering it foreign, and making violence to its referentiality. As one of his characters, who inexplicably finds himself blind, is desperately trying to get out of the thick forest, by setting one foot in front of the other, foot by foot, the phrase pé por si, is rendered as madly absurd as the character, unexpected situation. Pé por si, pé por si, pé or ep or si, pé ep or si. At the same time, in North America, Gertrude Stein, who intended buttons in 1914, had already made words stand solid and opaque, allowed herself properly to write in What is English Literature in 1935. She writes, you do see what I say. A few years earlier, on the other side of the Atlantic, in Livro do Desassossego, a book of fragments that is really the theory of a poet's practice, Fernando Pessoa, in the person of Bernardo Soares, wrote, gosto de palavras. As palavras são para mim corpos tocáveis, sereias visíveis, sensualidades encorpadas. I love words. Words are for me touchable bodies, visible sirens, embodied sensualities. 10 years earlier, in Peru, this is 1931, by the way, this passage from the book of Disquietude, as I like to say. 10 years earlier, in Peru, César Vallejo composed Trilce, 1922. Arguably the most revolutionary language adventure of the 20th century, a mestizo poem in which Spanish is sacrificed to Runasimi and Runasimi sacrificed to Spanish. 70 years later, one of Vallejo's translators into English, Próspero Saiz, himself a poet of mixed ancestry from the Navajo country in Arizona, would in turn disfigure the English language and render it foreign in The Birth of Nothing, 1993, thereby totally subverting the linguistic colonization of the Americas. If you bear with me for one more bounce across time and geography, I shall jump back to Europe in 1919 and to fetch you Odradek, the strange creature in Kafka's short story, Die Zorge des Hausvaters, the cares of family men, something like that, whose name nobody could ever really make out, Odradek. Neither the name nor the thing itself. Commentators and interpreters go from some unsophisticated, broken down, useless item kept in a house for no purpose, to Marxist commodities, to Freudian return of the repressed, to religious tradition, and many more. In a very fine and intelligently argued article, also published by us in Translocal Modernisms, Vivian Liska finds the cares of a family man a quintessentially modernist text. The narrator's efforts to come to terms both with Odradek and Odradek's unfathomable name prefigure, she shrewdly argues, and I quote, the various attempts to come to terms with modernism. Let me suggest, however, that Odradek may well embody no less than language itself. Perhaps just like Vallejo's Trilce, nobody knows what he meant by that. He never said. I mean, there are some theories about it, but nobody really knows. Trilce, what is it? I mean, language. Odradek is language. I mean, the uncanny creature living with us and intriguing us all the time, without letting us know whence it comes or where it goes. A weird thing assuming many shapes without letting itself be fixed. A solid yet living organism that is always changing but never dies. and is never exact either. Kafka's Odradek has affinities with the festa Buchstabe, the solid, firm letter, which more than a century before, Hölderlin had tremulously promised the German song at the close of his hymn Patmos. Tremulously, the poet promised, for language is the most precious, but also the most dangerous of possessions, as he himself acknowledges in another fragment. That is why in poetry, the desire for the exact word often goes hand in hand with demystification. Joyce needed the whole of Finnegan's Wake, 1939, to toy with this idea. Dickinson, a century earlier, just a little poem about searching philology in vain while the propounded word awaited until revelation came. Often, poetry takes advantage of the failure of language as solid word. Sometimes it happens. This is what happens, for example, in the Caribbean-Canadian poet Norbis Phillips' Zong, a poem of 2007, Zong, a long poem of shattered words scattered throughout the pages to make the horrifying silences of the middle passage speak. That scholars became uncomfortable with the concept of modernism very early on can be seen in the emergence of the concept of postmodernism at the close of the 60s, the 1960s. Soon, studies of modernism were speaking of myriad forms of post, while bringing into their discussion the concept of premodernism itself. Augusto de Campos, the Brazilian poet, provocatively constructive poem, Pós-Tudo, I wish I could show it to you, but I'm not very good with technologies. Augusto de Campos' provocatively deconstructive poem, Pós-Tudo, speaks to perfection, to the human compulsion to search for the new and to conceptualize, and what absolutely resists conceptualization, poetry. What Abel de Barros Batista and Osvaldo Manuel Silvestre say about Brazilian modernism, and they say that it is iconoclastic problematization of the poetic itself, applies to all strong poetry. And no strong poet pushed problematization, poetic problematization, as far as the Portuguese Fernando Pessoa, whose Lisbon, by the way, whether peripheral or semi-peripheral, hardly ever joins the so-called cities of modernism. Problematization, deconstruction, interruption, fragmentation, consciousness of time, futurism, decadence, defamiliarization, depersonalization, impersonation. These are all modernist topoi, which in Pessoa transcend one another. Depersonalization, that is to say heteronymy, his heteronyms, encompasses all of them. The self-interrupted heteronyms problematize and deconstruct authorship, each one of them in turn contesting the others from different spaces and times. There are, among several other ones, so-called lesser ones, I think they're lesser. Classical Ricardo Reis, just waiting in troubled placidity for time to come and go. There is pre-modern Alberto Caeiro, erasing poetry altogether. I'm not even a poet, I see, he said. Non sou poeta, vejo. Modern, or if you like, modernist Pessoa himself, conjuring up the hour of timelessness. Futurist decadent Álvaro de Campos, singing his tormented odes of triumph and defeat. And the scribbler of Livro do Desassossego, Bernardo Soares, who praises imperfected art and whose head aches along with the universe. I have suggested elsewhere that Pessoa's disquietude, this is a term I like, I prefer disquietude because the Romantics used it and I'm sure Pessoa would have used it himself. I have suggested elsewhere that Pessoa's disquietude is the quintessentially modernist counterpart of Schlegel's Unverständlichkeit. The universe, and not just the language, has now become untrustworthy. The poet takes refuge in the interval, interval, the void of nothingness, the in-betweenness of being non-being in multiplicity, is repeated more than 40 times in Livro Tudo Sossego. Signifying presence and absence at one and the same time, intervalo is the sign of the pessoa enigma of disquietude in Livro Tudo Sossego. The term carries different meanings in different passages and fragments, and they are all relevant, whether it be a proper interval, like an intermission in our show, or a space between things or people, feelings, etc., an unfathomable twilight zone, as it were. Intervalo is implicitly and explicitly disquieting. Entre sou, I am in between. Entre sou, the poet confesses, and the image of human existence in modern society suddenly appears as the eye's total vulnerability in incomprehensibility. No wonder Harry Arutunian chose Livro do Sossego to preside over his histories of disquiet. 2000. To conclude, let me just tell you briefly about the moving and hilarious modernism with a human face. This is a parodical fictional title of a fictional book by a fictional paper architect created by David Mazzucchelli, graphic novelist, in a truly untimely graphic novel, 2009. In time, it will be woven into my narrative of untimely fictions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that travel through time and space, and with such thought-provoking suggestions for us to pick up on. And thank you for keeping to time. That was excellent. I will now open the floor for questions. Yes.
I appreciate very much your beautiful lecture, and I'm asking myself if you would subscribe to polemical question or polemical doubt addressed to the current domination of cultural studies, to post-colonialism, to various approaches emphasizing the context, the social context of literary work, since you showed us with so many quotations and examples to which point all strong poets are modernists. I thought all the time of Dante, who is the first critic of capitalism, of accumulation, an experimental poet who is absolutely, who did, for us he stays, not only he stays a monumental figure enclosed in manuals, but also recently in Italy, the question has been posed whether Dante should not be expelled from schools because of his homophobic and anti-Semitic attitudes. So I'm sorry if I put so many digressions in. I hope you understood my question.
Yeah, I guess I did, because I heard you before. I have nothing against cultural studies. I do it myself. I mean, my training is in American studies. Do you know of any more cultural studies than American studies? It's when I study poetry that I think that we have to distinguish things. And I think that in poetry, in studying poetry, you have to take care, to look at the context and this history and economy, everything. I mean, I do it in my paper, right? But to really appreciate poetry, I think there's no, what I basically want to say is that there's no center or periphery. They are all center. For example, when, so I heard here in one of the panels that Picasso was borrowing those ugly masks from Africa. I mean, they did not become art in Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, the mask, when he paints the women in that way. They were art before. That's what I mean. I don't know whether I mean. Of course, about Dante being expelled from schools, I think this is ridiculous. And what we have to do is to teach the students about history, context, time, ways of being, and all sorts of things.
But it's a serious possibility.
I know. I've read about it. It's like in the United States there was this very tense discussion about who is going to teach African American studies.
Oh my
Because the
God.
whites were teaching African American studies, and that was not proper. And Toni Morrison said, things can be learned. She was not against it, of course not, because she's an intelligent woman. She said, no, things can be learned. People, of course, it's a problem when only whites get the jobs. That's another problem, another situation.
Thank you very much. Can I ask, since you mentioned Harold Bloom as one of your mentors, and I was wondering in a context of timelessness, what happens to Bloom's anxiety of influence? Is that...
Well, the anxiety of influence of Bloom starts with Milton. Milton is the great covering cherub, so to speak, to use a phrase by Bloom himself. And then the Romantics. That's only male poets and only Romantic poets apparently have the anxiety of influence, according to the anxiety of influence book. Of course, then he elaborated on that a little bit, and there's a chart and everything. The fact that I said that Bloom is my beloved teacher, that means that I agree entirely with him. We had interesting discussions all along, and he was a great mentor, and I still am in touch with him. I call him when I have an anxiety, because I can't remember where. Yeah, exactly. When I can't remember where to pin down something in one of the poets that we studied together. I studied with him, and actually he failed me once, and I was so happy that he was not, omniscient. So yeah, the anxiety of influence is very limited. There's a book by a couple of women, The Woman in the Attic. Some people here may know this book, in which they take off from Bloom and say, well, he never. They apply the idea of transmission, the killing the father, not killing the mother, but the father, and then writing the poem, more or less. And the women, these two women, Susan Guber and Sandra Gilbert, they criticize Bloom for not speaking of women, and then he comes up with another word, resentment. These women, what they have is resentment, borrowing from Nietzsche, of course. But it is interesting. But it's just the anxiety of influence is about Romantic poets being influenced, having this. Of course, they were also influenced, sort of blocked by the previous one. But Milton is the core. It's not Shakespeare. It's interesting. It's Milton.
I was wondering, going from that, and we'll take your answer that question in a moment. But just related to that, and if the fact, if you're thinking in an achronological model that you were proposing or starting to think about, perhaps his notion of misreading or might be more productive, as in, because anxiety of influence does seem to suggest and have implied the idea of diachrony, so time passing
Oh, yes,
in
it's
one
sort
thing
of
following
hierarchical
model.
genealogy.
Yeah. No, I don't want to sound achronological. I mean, it's not the chronology that I'm interested in. I'm interested in history. That's why you noted that I gave you the dates. The very piece I'm off. I forgot one or two. But they gave you the dates. It's important when they are published and what is happening at the time, etc. That's all very important. But yeah, with Bloom, of course, his fathers is the precursor and the ephebi. That's the terminology, right? the precursor and the Ephebi. Of course, I say, and actually I've written it, that Pessoa invented his own precursor by designating Queiro, the master of them all, right? So he invented his own precursor. He doesn't have any precursor. So the anxiety and the influence doesn't affect Pessoa. He was preposterously shrewd to invent his own master.
I'll take your question and then Silva. Yes.
Well, thank you very much for your talk. So reflection on your talk and a reflection on what I've been thinking over these 2 days about the notion center-periphery. Coming from the periphery myself, I came here thinking that I knew what the centers were, and I'm really confused now. I think that I think it's easier sometimes to know or think that we know where the peripheries are. It's easier than knowing where the centers are, if that makes any sense. So I was thinking, if we were to have a conference on center modernities, what kind of, how would we, be presenting, what sort of issues would come across, and what sort of dialogues we'll be seeing if we reverse the terms of that. So I guess then my question, I find this notion of periphery very problematic, as you do, and you mentioned this yesterday to Perry about can we get rid of this notion of periphery, which I'd like to believe we can, but I mean, how can we really escape this? Then what would guide us? What? I'm very confused. I think, which is good.
I think we confused you. No, my disagreement with Perry yesterday was that although she seemed to be speaking of periphery as the world system concept, Wallerstein's center, core, periphery, semi-periphery, she kept talking about peripheral novels and peripheral works of art. And that I didn't like. I thought that, and she said, no, but it's exactly what I mean. But still, she continued to speak of, okay, it wouldn't be okay with me to say that Brazil was peripheral at the time that she was speaking, Brás Cubas, peripheral. But to say that Brás Cubas is a peripheral novel, it's outrageous to me.
Yes, because I would have never put Portugal in the periphery. That's why I thought I knew where the centers were, but I don't.
Yeah, Portugal was the center for about, I don't know how many years in the 16th century.
Yeah, but it's never a port.
Right, I mean, it was for a very, very short time.
So if we get rid of this notion of the periphery, what? Where do we move from? How?
Move to the center.
Yeah.
I'll take Elder's question and then I'll take yours next.
Well, that was very interesting, and I share, very much on your healthy confusion. Because indeed, I mean, there's a mixture, isn't there, of a political or economic concept and the aesthetic one. And in your marvelous lesson, many things that you did and that you abolished, I mean, one that you abolished is the concept of modern, by dealing precisely with the continuity of the modern.
Mm-hmm.
And in the process, you destroyed any possible idea of a post-modern. If it is a continuum, there is not a pause there. There's a suicide, if you want. But one thing that you mentioned, which I think is very central to culture, to literature, to periphery or not, modernity or not, is the belief in the untruth. That I think is a key concept in aesthetic.
The fiction.
The fiction. The belief in that which one knows is untrue, and therefore one believes. And just a while ago you mentioned Pessoa's trick of inventing his own master, well, he does that by beginning with a statement that says that his master is untrue. Remember this, Cairo is the poet that goes against metaphor. Totally, isn't it? No, I mean, there's a metaphor, I only see, there's only things. The first line of Guardador de Rebanhos is: eu nunca guardei rebanhos, mas é como se os guardasse. No, that's a metaphor. So all his work is metaphoric from there on. This is not leading to a question, but to my compliments to you.
Oh, thank you. Let me just add that Bernardo Soares, at one point, says that I never had a master to teach me. Nunca tive mestre. So it's all the endless contradictions. Nelson.
Okay. Maria, thank you very much for your lecture. It was really inspiring and fantastic. Muito obrigado. Well, I really appreciate your, when you mentioned that Wallerstein's theories of economic doesn't apply to arts, but being an architect, this is really helpful because that gets rid of a lot of stuff for my research. But then I'm intrigued with something. Well, I talked to you yesterday, and even today you also mentioned that you, at a certain point, you christened Pessoa as a poet of the semi-periphery. And then I'm really a little bit intrigued.
No, I didn't say that. No, I wrote a paper saying Pessoa, inventor da semi-periphery.
Okay.
That's what I wrote that paper. But it's translated in Italian.
Okay, that's well. Nevertheless, it's also interesting because you also mentioned that in the Livro do Sossego, there is always this obsession with this in-betweenness, with interval. And so I wonder to what extent this condition of Portugal, as Boaventura also presented Portuguese condition as a position in this semi-peripheral position, but as a good thing, not as something that has an identity, as his own identity. So not something as you refer to the periphery as something bad, So is it? No. No. So I would like to ask you if to what extent do you think that positions such as Portuguese as something this in-betweenness is something that could be also helpful to understand this cultural.
I think that's very, very good indeed. And there's this other book that we put together, Antonio Sousa Ribeiro and myself. We are always putting things together. That's titled. Patricia mentioned it. Entre ser e estar. Between being and being there. Let's translate this. Entre ser e estar. This is a line by Albert Camus. Entre ser e estar, diferença de verbo que corresponde à realidade. It's between being and being there, and of course ser e estar in Portuguese are different. Ser, whereas in other languages you have the same word being, and being there is the same word, but not in Portuguese. You have ser, estar, being there. And so the difference, the verb that corresponds to reality. And perhaps that's a Portuguese condition. Yeah, we have to think about that. We are in between. Neither center nor periphery. That's why I like that title for the panel this afternoon. Yeah.
But very, very fast. Only I was thinking that this in-between is not exactly a geographical point, but it's exactly the literary point. It is literature in itself. The in-between space is the space we live that is not in when we talk to each other, but what's happening in between, exactly. So that in-betweenness, when it comes to the paper and to the word, is the interval, it's the literature. And I think if one analyzes enough of Álvaro de Campos, like the Oda Marítima starts where he's standing there, and then he goes out of himself into that in-betweenness, the poem happens, and then he comes back to himself. And this happens all the time.
So maybe, I'm not sure. And I agree with this condition of great poetry and great literature, like in the sense Octavio Paz would speak about it, that is like everything in art that is great or touches or whatever could be called poetry. And that is always present, modern, and happening, whatever it is, whenever it is. So one has to touch it with a different, pick it up with different, whatever you call it, I don't know.
Tweezers.
Yeah, tweezers. You have to be careful with it because they never fit.
Would you like to ask your question?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your wonderful and very inspiring talk. I'm from the Neither Center Nor Periphery panel, so and it's, I think what has emerged, I think, and this is quite interesting, is also, and something that you also mentioned in your talk, is that definitions of modernism really have been were sort of developed and appropriated mainly by the Anglo-American. So here we're really talking about a sort of, can I say, a bit of a colonizing concept, if not colonial, but there is a sort of, because of course, we've been talking about literature, but if we talk about art, clearly it is not, is the very center of modernism wasn't situated in the Anglo-American world. So the notions of centers and peripheries, begin to be blurred more, and this conference has been interdisciplinary very much in its essence. So I think there comes a moment when, the notion of the center has to be, in a way, made more relative, I would say. For me it was very interesting because I was talking about Italian culture, and Italian culture of course had this very sort of anxious relationship with modernity and some of the centers of modernity, because of course it claimed a very central part in the construction of the Western canon, except that it was considered to be peripheral in terms of modernity. So I think it is becoming more and more impossible, I have the impression, to really define the periphery as such.
I don't know what to say. I think that, I agree with you. I was at that panel. And actually, I liked the title, and I went to the panel, and I enjoyed it very much. And we learned a lot. I've been learning a lot about this conference. Thank you.
Theo, would you like to ask a question?
Thanks again for your lecture. I was just wondering whether the centre-periphery conundrum could possibly be addressed by running a bit with some of the spatial implications of your paper. For example, your application of the circumference forces one to think about circulation, and that your paper struck me as very much about circulation of ideas, of poetic models and transformations and so on. Indeed, it struck me as being rather an Atlantic paper.
An Atlantic paper. Yeah, I crossed the Atlantic a few times.
Absolutely, absolutely. Ça se voit, as we say. And in various other domains, the use of a spatial category such as the Atlantic, which favours so much discussion of circulation, exchange, transformation, movement in particular. In various other domains, a category such as that is indeed used to try and undo the centre-periphery relationship. If we think about the relationship between France and the Americas and so on. Or indeed, if we think about Edouard Glissant in the Caribbean, talking about a distinction, say, between continental thought and the archipelago as being something which is not bound, not centred, and so on, which is about movement, circulation, etc. I just wondered what your thoughts were about, whether you'd just like to prolong a little bit further the spatial and Atlantic implications of your paper.
Well, I'm very fond of the Atlantic. I wrote a book titled Atlantic Poets. And also one of the poets, he wrote, I don't know whether you notice that I quoted a poet, or I mentioned a poet from the Caribbean, and she's actually living in Canada right now, Lourdes Phillips, has this wonderful song poem, which is actually it's a misspelled name of ship that would carry slaves across the Atlantic, and then at one point they had to throw the slaves onto the sea because the cargo shipwreck. But yeah, I like the idea of moving. You know, the other conference that started for moving modernism. Yeah, I don't know what to say. I mean, the Atlantic. Of course, you know, this book that was mentioned this morning or this afternoon, I know, The Black Atlantic by Paul.
Yes, indeed.
That's the he claims that's the beginning, the first modern experience is the slaves, the blacks. And then the crossing of cultures coming from there to here, not from Europe to there, but from the United States or the Americas to Europe.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
So that idea I find interesting.
But I think he's very much trying to challenge centrism, two
Right,
kinds of centrism. It's the idea that modernity, modernism is an Occidental, or European or North American.
Yeah,
thing.
Nietzsche said that.
But also
history is
against
Occidental.
sorry.
When Nietzsche says history is an Occidental prejudice, I would say that center is an Occidental prejudice.
Sure, absolutely, yes. But he's also arguing against Afrocentrism and using Atlantic together to try and get away from both centrism. I just thought that for the dilemma around Portugal and Portuguese culture and so on, Portuguese-speaking cultures, the Atlantic is a useful de-hierarchizing concept, which actually, if it does have a centre, puts Portugal at it, so every year.
Well, might not.
And not just in the 16th century, but everything that has happened since.
It's shifting to Brazil in many cases. What about the archipelago? That was fascinating, very interesting.
The archipelago in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
Yeah, so and the possibility, Glissant talks about it very much about the Caribbean, where for him a sort of proto-globalization occurs before everywhere else in terms of religion and cultures. But I think it may be possible to extend the notion of archipelago to other kinds of collections of spaces, whether it's the Lusophone world in the Atlantic or France and the Americas and so on.
Thank you. I think that's
a very interesting concept.
And also the fact that, you know, I like to speak of constellations of poets, but archipelagos of poets would be an interesting concept. Was someone asking?
Yes, Polly, you had another question. No, it was only a last note on this idea of the it's Pessoa, if we think about Pessoa, probably the center is void. When it comes to it, when it really comes down to the center. It's very interesting how Pessoa constructs everything around the void. So if one thinks about the whole rethinking the period from that perspective, it could be interesting too. But no, I want to thank you very much, and I'd love to hear someone go your in the list of poets, because that was very interesting too. Because thank you.
I'd say there's one more by Elsie. Yes.
There has been a very interesting and productive discussion on that is space-based, the center periphery, or the problematization of them, which recalls me certain developments in Brazil, away from the spatial dimension, but bringing in chronology. Perhaps given the tremendous regional diversity of the country. I remember one occasion a project that was launched on late modernidade tardia, bringing, for example, the possibility that not all happened in 1922, in that Brazilian modernism has a very set date of beginning. But other developments within the same country, such as Brasília being an example of modernidade tardia, in writings by Guimarães Rosa, for example, when he meditates on the construction of Brasilia, etc., that brings in within the same country a sense of chronology. So I would like to see your opinion on how productive you see this possibility of this autochthonous development in Brazil, how productive you see this idea of bringing in chronology as well and diverse modernisms within the same, perhaps the same country.
Well, I like dates, certainly, very much. About modernidade tardia, I know the little book by Eneida de Souza.
Yes, exactly.
But that's about Minas Gerais, no?
Yeah, partly yes, Belo Horizonte.
Belo Horizonte. Modernidade tardia. And it's very interesting. It's all about architecture, right?
No, not only branches into
journalism and architecture. I mean, I read the book a couple of days ago.
Yeah, the one that Eneida wrote, but it was a larger project.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Involved a lot of Brasilia as well. And
yeah, I don't see the point of saying late. Why late? You know?
It's another adjective.
It's another modifier.
In relation to what? Mm-hmm. In relation to what? You know?
Yeah, compared to what, as Steve Wonder would say. Compared to what? That's these modifiers that bother me a little bit, you know.
Yeah.
So you don't see...
I don't think it's useful to speak of modernidade tardia.
That's what I wanted to know from the
Okay.
Are there any further urgent, pressing questions? I think maybe we have come to a good time to pause and continue discussing over some wine, which is very welcome at this stage. I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking again Professor Ramalho for her fascinating talk.